The Roman Empire collapses, and the world plunges into chaos. But that's only the beginning. In between Viking raids, Islamic science, Crusader bloodbaths, and the Black Death, the Middle Ages shaped everything we know. But how did it all actually unfold? And why did the East race ahead while Europe stayed in the dark? The year is 476 AD. Rome, once the world's greatest empire, falls, and with it, the lights go out across Western Europe. What follows isn't just political collapse, it's the breakdown of roads, currency, trade, and education. Entire cities are abandoned, farmers return to small plots, bandits roam freely. Safety, once guaranteed by Roman legions, becomes a memory. For most people, life shrinks to whatever's right in front of them, their village, their church, their next meal. There are no schools, no libraries. If you're born a peasant, you die a peasant, never knowing there was once a world of marble columns and mathematics. Latin starts to fade, records are lost, buildings crumble. The average person will never see a book, let alone read one. But not everything disappears. Hidden in remote corners of Europe, monasteries become time capsules. Monks spend their lives copying manuscripts by hand, preserving what little remains of ancient Greek and Roman thought. These places are cold, strict, and silent, but they're also Europe's last defense against total intellectual extinction. And while the West is struggling to survive, the East is watching. The Byzantine Empire still holds Constantinople. And far to the south, a new force is rising fast, one that will soon redraw the map and challenge everything Europe thought it knew. While Europe splintered, the East awakened. In the early 7th century, a man named Muhammad began preaching in Mecca. Within decades, Islam wasn't just a religion, it was a political force. The Islamic Caliphate expanded at a pace that stunned the world, sweeping across Arabia, Persia, North Africa, and into Spain. But their eyes were always fixed on Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire. In 674, Muslim forces launched their first siege on the city. What they met wasn't just walls and soldiers, it was Greek fire, a fearsome Byzantine weapon, possibly made from oil, sulfur, and saltpeter. It could be hurled at enemy ships and keep burning on water. Like an early flamethrower, it incinerated entire fleets and became the stuff of nightmares. The siege failed, but the East wasn't done. A second assault came in 717, and again, the Byzantines held firm. These weren't just battles, they were civilization-defining standoffs. On one side, a Christian empire defending its capital with ancient Roman tech and religious zeal. On the other, a rapidly expanding Islamic world powered by unity, purpose, and military brilliance. Meanwhile, the West barely noticed. Europe was too broken to react. Kings were crowned in muddy fields, trade was dead, and survival still depended on weather, crops, and luck. But while swords clashed in Constantinople, ideas were spreading faster than armies. And soon, an invention on horseback would change the way wars were fought, and who would win them. First came a piece of iron and leather, simple but revolutionary, the stirrup. It arrived in Europe around the 8th century, and it changed warfare forever. For the first time, a rider could stand firmly in the saddle, absorb shock, and swing a sword without falling off. Mounted soldiers became tanks on horseback. Cavalry charges weren't just intimidating, they were unstoppable. Power started shifting. Lords who could afford horses and armor became warlords. Castles rose, and feudalism, the system where land was traded for loyalty and protection, began to lock society into place. But the chaos wasn't just internal. From the icy seas came the Vikings. In 793, they raided the monastery at Lindisfarne, unleashing a wave of terror across Europe. These weren't just mindless brutes, they were skilled sailors and explorers. They carved through rivers and coasts, striking without warning. Paris, London, Dublin, nowhere was safe. Yet, their longships didn't just bring violence, they brought discovery. The Norse reached Iceland, Greenland, and even touched North America, long before Columbus. Some say Irish monks, driven by faith and curiosity, may have reached these places first, but it was the Vikings who left settlements. As monasteries burned and villages paid tribute, the map of Europe was being redrawn by force and by sail. But amidst the destruction, a single ruler would rise and try to bring light back to the West through schools, science, and an unexpected love for learning. In the year 800 AD, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. It was more than a title, it was a statement. The dream of Rome wasn't dead, it had just moved north. Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror, he was obsessed with learning. Despite being barely literate himself, he filled his court with scholars from across Europe and beyond. His empire stretched across modern-day France, Germany, and Italy. And at its center, he started what historians now call the Carolingian Renaissance. Schools were opened, mostly in monasteries, and education became a tool of empire. But this wasn't just about training priests. Students studied the 7 liberal arts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, to think and speak clearly; arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, to understand the world and the divine. Books were recopied in a new, standardized script. Latin was cleaned up, and for the first time in centuries, Europe wasn't just preserving knowledge, it was producing it again. Charlemagne also encouraged education for some women, especially in convents. It wasn't equality, but it was unusual for the time. His reforms didn't reach everyone. Most peasants still worked the land in ignorance. But for scholars, monks, and the elite, a flicker of intellectual life had returned. Still, Europe was playing catch-up, because while Charlemagne was reviving old Roman lessons, the Islamic world was rewriting the rules of science, not with prayers, but with experiments. From Baghdad to Cordoba, from Cairo to Samarkand, cities flourished with architecture, art, and most of all, knowledge. The Abbasid Caliphate founded the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a place where Greek, Persian, Indian, and Roman texts were translated into Arabic, studied, and expanded upon. But they didn't stop at preservation. They challenged the texts, tested them, and added to them. In chemistry, Jabir ibn Hayyan explored distillation, acids, and compounds, laying foundations for modern chemical science. In mathematics, Al-Khwarizmi introduced algebra, systematized equations, and popularized the use of Hindu numerals, the numbers we still use today. In medicine, Al-Razi identified the difference between measles and smallpox and developed methods for antiseptic treatment. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote The Canon of Medicine, a book so advanced it was taught in European universities for centuries. And in optics, Ibn al-Haytham revolutionized how we understand light, vision, and experimentation itself, emphasizing that knowledge must come through observation and logic, not just belief. Meanwhile, in Europe, illness was treated with prayer and leeches, astrology guided medical decisions, and outside of monasteries, scientific progress was a distant rumor. The East was thriving in libraries, the West was praying for rain. But ideas, like armies, have a way of crossing borders, and the collision between these two worlds was about to begin, not with trade, but with war. By the end of the 11th century, the Christian West had finally looked up and saw that the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, was under Muslim control. So they marched. In 1096, the First Crusade began, a chaotic collision of faith, politics, and power. Tens of thousands of Europeans, from knights to peasants, took up the cross and set off to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. What followed was brutality. Cities were sieged, populations massacred. In 1199, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in a blood-soaked conquest. Even fellow Christians from the East were caught in the slaughter. But this wasn't just a holy war. It was a cultural shock. The Crusaders found cities with public baths, libraries, advanced medicine, and spices they'd never tasted. They brought back silk, sugar, and, without realizing it, knowledge. But not everyone welcomed new ways of thinking. In 1139, Pope Innocent II banned the use of the crossbow, not against enemies of the church, but against Christians, calling it unfit for use among the faithful due to its deadly efficiency. In a time where war was still seen as honorable, the crossbow was seen as cheating. Meanwhile, Muslim scholars like Averroes, known in the Islamic world as Ibn Rushd, were diving deep into Aristotle's philosophy, blending reason with faith, and writing commentaries that would later spark revolutions in European thought. Those commentaries were translated into Latin by Dominican monks and quietly passed through universities. Not everyone noticed it then, but this was the start of something big. Because soon, Europe would begin using logic and reason, not to challenge faith, but to explain it, and that shift would change everything. While crusaders fought with swords, scholars began to fight with ideas. The writings of Averroes, translated from Arabic into Latin, landed in European universities, and they hit like a bomb. Aristotle, once buried in ancient Greek, was now reborn through the lens of Islamic thinkers, and with him came a dangerous idea. Truth could be discovered through reason. It wasn't long before European scholars took this idea and ran with it. At the University of Paris, a young monk named Thomas Aquinas didn't reject faith. He tried to prove it through logic. He blended Christianity with Aristotle's philosophy, arguing that the laws of nature and the existence of God weren't separate, they were connected. This was the birth of scholasticism, a movement that treated theology like science, using arguments, counter-arguments, and rational debate. Meanwhile, Europe's first true universities had emerged. Bologna focused on law, Paris on theology, Oxford on a little of everything. And they weren't just extensions of churches. These were intellectual battlegrounds, where students and professors clashed over everything from grammar to cosmology. For the first time in centuries, Europe was producing its own thinkers, not just copying old ones. There was tension, of course. Some feared that too much logic could lead to heresy, but the door had been opened, and curiosity was flooding in. Still, Europe remained behind in many ways. Disease, famine, and war were constant threats. But something had changed. The West no longer accepted ignorance as fate, and as the 13th and 14th centuries unfolded, a wave of inventions would push Europe further, from the fields to the seas to the stars. The winds were finally shifting. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe wasn't just reading old texts, it was building on them, and invention was no longer the privilege of faraway empires. In the countryside, windmills harnessed nature to grind grain and pump water, reducing labor and increasing food supply. In cities, spectacles helped aging scholars keep reading and writing well into their twilight years. And in the ports, one small object changed navigation forever: the magnetic compass. With it, sailors could now travel farther and with more certainty, opening the door to exploration, trade, and eventually, empire. Another unsung hero, the spinning wheel. It arrived from India and transformed Europe's textile production. Clothes became cheaper, trade expanded, the economy began to wake up. And then came the Silk Road. Under Mongol rule, the route from East Asia to Europe became surprisingly safe, at least for a time. Goods, stories, and scholars flowed in both directions. Europeans tasted tea, wore Chinese silk, and, more importantly, absorbed knowledge. They learned about gunpowder, paper, and advanced mathematics. They saw maps that stretched beyond their imagination, and some began to wonder what else was out there. Europe was still deeply religious, still recovering from centuries of instability, but it was no longer in the dark. Curiosity was growing. Innovation was accelerating. And then disaster struck. Just as Europe was finding its rhythm, the world went silent. In 1347, a ship docked in Sicily. On board, rats, fleas, and something invisible and lethal. The Black Death tore through Europe like fire in dry grass. In just 4 years, it killed an estimated 1/3 of the continent's population. Entire towns were erased. Fields went unplowed. Priests, doctors, and nobles died alongside peasants. Society cracked. Some turned to religion, others to violence. Some thought it was the end of days. But beneath the chaos, something else began to stir. Change. With so many dead, labor became precious. Serfs demanded wages. Feudalism started to break. People moved. Ideas spread. And a new class, merchants, bankers, artisans, began to rise. Then, in the 1440s, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg created a machine that would redefine the world, the printing press. No longer would knowledge crawl from one monastery to the next. Now it could fly. Page by page, copy by copy, books became cheaper, literacy soared, and the old gatekeepers of knowledge, the church and the elite, began to lose their grip. In 1492, Columbus sailed west and accidentally stumbled into a continent that would reshape global power forever. The age of exploration had begun, and as the medieval world stumbled to a close, one man stood at the edge of the new age, notebook in hand, dissecting corpses, sketching flying machines, and asking questions no one else dared to. His name was Leonardo da Vinci, and with him, the Renaissance had arrived. For nearly 1,000 years, Europe staggered forward through blood, ignorance, and survival. Empires fell, plagues emptied cities, and knowledge flickered dangerously close to extinction. But it never went out. From the ashes of Rome, through Viking raids and Crusader campaigns, through the whispers of Greek logic preserved in Arabic script, Europe learned to learn again. It wasn't fast, it wasn't clean, but by the time Da Vinci was sketching helicopters, Europe had finally caught up and was ready to lead. So the next time someone says the Middle Ages were just plague, swords, and superstition, tell them about Da Vinci, tell them about Jabir, tell them about the monks, the maps, the numbers, and the fire that burned on water. History didn't sleep for 1,000 years, it just took the long way forward. But while science and ideas were crawling back into the light, life for women was a different story. Forced marriages, witch trials, public punishments, and rules that sound almost too cruel to be real. In the next video, we dive into the messed up things women endured in the medieval ages.